Hello everyone and welcome to our latest webinar. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rob Newton. I'm the Marketing Manager here at Visual Impact. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Crocker from Sony, and we're going to be discussing HDR in all its forms, all the way from entry-level acquisition to top-end cinematography.
Okay, hello everybody. So for those of you who don't know me, and if you ever have been to a trade show and been on the Sony stand, you've probably seen me. I'm the enormous man with a beard. I'm sure I've met and I recognize a couple of names from the list of people who've signed in already, so good to see you all here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tom Crocker. I'm a product specialist based out in charming Basingstoke at Sony Professional Headquarters for Europe, and I look after the broadcast and cinematography cameras, specifically for the UK and Ireland. But also significantly the workflow behind those things and a lot of the other systems that enable those workflows, specifically things like codecs and other interesting systems like, for example, EOTFs, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit. So today's agenda and what I'm going to sort of run us through in broad terms is an introduction to HDR in terms of what it actually is, what it's trying to achieve, and how it works, and some of the fundamental concepts which we'll need before we move on to the next stage, which is how we actually work with HDR. And it was interesting to see the poll results with a lot of people saying no, but we know we need to, answering the question, are you shooting in HDR yet? Because I'll bet most of you actually are shooting in HDR already. You probably just don't know it. But we'll come on to that in a little bit. So working with HDR, EOTF, what is that? And indeed, OETF, what is that? And setting up your camera, how we work with that. A new concept that Sony has brought into a couple of cameras which we launched at NAB called Instant HDR, which is a very, very simple way of approaching the HDR question. A bit of stuff about working and viewing, and then a recap of some of the resources available to you when this is over, where you can find out additional information, additional training. If you look at that, I'm sure you'll find that I've shamelessly stolen some of these slides from some of the equipment our training team has put together. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about HDR from the very bottom. So let's talk about dynamic range before we start adding the H. Let's just talk about dynamic range. On the left, we've got a range of different luminances. We've got some light sources that we're all familiar with. We've got starlight and moonlight. Increasing in brightness to an indoor light, an incandescent light. We would then pass through a fluorescent light and LEDs and things up to sunlight and then direct sunlight. We've got all of these different luminances in the world that we move around in. Now, we can't see all of these at the same time. We can't see the stars behind the sun. We don't have the dynamic range for that. We can't do that. So how much can we see? Well, that's what this and this slightly creepy and bloodshot eye is to demonstrate, but this is the one we had available, so next time I'll try and find a prettier eye, but this one will at least hold your attention. The human eye can see about 10 to the 5, which, as you can see from those bars across at the top of the arrow there, apologies for the rumbling noise in the background, that's sort of the range that you can see without adjustment. Now, when we talk about adjustment in the concept or in the context of us, it's of course the iris on our eye, and that moves from night vision to day vision. Now, there's going to be a bit of an animation here. I've seen it run. It sort of works. You should get the idea. That's going to move down, and the iris is going to open, and it's going to move back up, and the iris is going to close again. And that's how we sort of navigate these different levels of brightness. Now, when we then talk about a camera, that works in a very, very similar way. It also has an iris, which is closed so that you can film outdoors on a sunny day. You open it right up if you're in the dark. That's how a camera works. We're all familiar with that. So how does this then map together? Well, the interesting thing is that the capture range of a modern camera, if you're looking at, for example, an f/55 or an FS7 or something like that, you're going to see about 14 stops coming out of that. Now that's about what human vision can see as well. That actually maps pretty accurately. So where's the problem? The problem is that we have an SDR system in between. Now there are various legacy reasons for why this system exists, but suffice to say it can only show us about 10 to the 3, and that leads to a range of different problems, which you'll all be familiar with. but one of the most obvious is it leads to a grading process and in a production where you're forced to make decisions about which parts of the image you show. And in your production daily life, you're going to go out and look at a scene and you're going to say, no, well, this room is too dark because that window's too bright. And that's going to cause you problems. It might be interrupting the story, it might be something you want to show, but it isn't necessarily ideal, and it's not going to provide you with the flexibility that you really want to be able to work with. Not only from a purely practical lighting perspective, but from a storytelling perspective as well. So what we want to do is fundamentally widen that pipe, be able to get everything that the camera can see all the way through to everything that we can see. Now, we could widen it further, and in time I'm sure the cameras will be able to see even more. Our eyes are unlikely to see even more. So another thing that we need to keep in mind here, particularly when it comes to your output grade of your project, is making sure that you've still got something that's comfortable to watch. In real life, we don't jump cut. So our eyes aren't used to jumping from intense brightness to intense darkness at 1/24th of a second. That's a difficult thing to watch. So it's something to keep in mind that the viewer's experience also needs to be considered here, because you can start to push the edges and make things a little uncomfortable. Anyway, we'll come more onto that later. So HDR is to widen that tunnel. Let's have a look at this exact procedure again and describe this in a little bit more detail. So now what we're going to do is zoom in on the capture and HDR system side right up to that red line on the right, which we can then imagine as the playout of the screen that you're watching this on. So here we've got our typical range, and we've kept our chart from the previous slide with the arrow running top to bottom, and we've got our 10 to the 5th tonal range that we can see, and we're capturing that. And we've got a camera shooting 16-bit RAW. Let's say it's an F55 shooting RAW. It's easy for the example. And that's capturing a whole lot of information. And we can see this in the 3 pictures above. Now, one thing I will, of course, touch on here, which is very important, is that even if you're watching this on a fancy HDR monitor or TV at home, we're not in control of an HDR pipe out to you. So this presentation itself is SDR. So a lot of the pictures that we've used as examples will illustrate the concepts, but they aren't actually HDR because we're in an SDR world. Frequently at trade shows, we'll bring these amazing HDR TVs and wall panels and things like that that show these amazing pictures, and you get people coming up and taking a photo of them with their iPhone to show their friends. Now I appreciate the thought, but it's never going to work because it's moving that image back into an SDR world. If you haven't seen an HDR picture, a true HDR picture, try and get along to a trade show, or indeed some of the bigger electrical retailers now have proper HDR stuff. We'll touch on how it's spreading into the consumer world later on as well. Anyway, so above the camera gray square there, we've got a picture of a dark room with a bright window. Now, in that picture, and I hope the compression across the internet hasn't ruined this completely, but I'm hoping it will be able to illustrate the principle, is that through that window you can see we've got a lot of detail. We can see some trees, some houses, some gradation in the crops there, in the clouds. But when we move to transmission, all of that's lost because we're trying to keep the detail in the room. And that's a terrible pity. It becomes a decision that has to be made where something has to be cut, and that's not ideal. It's going to come across as less realistic, less lifelike, less comfortable for the viewer to watch because we're only using that 10 to the 3 range which is currently available. In a graph form, you can see it further down. We've got, and I will try and use my mouse a bit here. No, that's not coming across. In the graph form on the bottom left, we've got, here we are, lovely. The graph form on the bottom left, you can see we've got this missing area. That line running diagonally up there, which I hope you can all see me indicating, is showing the tonal range in the physical scene, but the signal level is restricted and cuts off and flattens everything beyond this 100 nit point. Now, there are a couple of terms which I'm going to be using a little interchangeably. They are nit and candle is per square meter. They are essentially the same metric, and they measure brightness effectively. And with HDR, a lot of the discussion is around brightness. Nit comes from, it's an abbreviation of the Latin term for sparkling, I think, if I remember right. In any case, so that's what we've got. And then once you hit the transmission, of course, the display, that's just showing it's what's transmitted, so we've lost something. So then there's the middle ground, and if you are on an HDR display and you've just got an HDR output switched on, maybe this is happening. You might be getting a lot more brightness out of it, but of course the display isn't intelligent enough to know what was in the window before it was transmitted. It can only work with what it's got. So some systems today will be a bit HDR-ish, and they will arguably scale up the dynamic range of the image, but they won't actually get you back the information you lost when you squeezed it to transmit. So that's not really ideal, and you can see in the expanded section here, we've still got this cutoff across the top. We're not getting any tonal detail in that. We've just pushed it higher up. That's not ideal. Now, if we then have a look at a proper full HDR chain with an HDR transmission signal and an HDR display, we're retaining the detail and the tonal diversity of the image the entire way through, and that's very significant. So here you can see we're now not crushing until 1000 nits, which is much higher up. So we're getting much more brightness out of it. Now you'll see this chart in the middle. I'm going to come back to that in just a few slides, where we're talking about using OETF and EOTF. They stand for optical electrotransfer function and electro-optical transfer function. But like I say, we'll come back in just a second. Before we get to that, I want to talk about color as well, because HDR is very significantly a technology which improves the brightness and dynamic range of an image, but it has a significant impact on color as well. And this should sort of start to explain that. Now, as part of HDR being rolled out, there's also something called Rec 2020, which is a new sort of broadcast standard, which basically says what sort of frame rates we can go at, what sort of rasters we can use, but also what colors are available to us. If we look at this color gamut here, I'm sure all of you have seen one of these charts before. It's a sort of mathematical representation of all of the colors that we can see. Now, the innermost sort of yellow triangle there is the HDTV Rec 709 triangle. It's a very old triangle. I don't think it was changed much from the preceding Rec 601 triangle, which defined SDTV, which I think goes all the way back to the introduction of color television. So really we're quite restricted in those colors. Now, even if you're on a computer, you're probably not operating with a color space much larger than that. There are a few others around, but probably not a lot larger. Now, the Rec 2020 color space is a lot larger. Now, if we then start to think about this three-dimensionally, here's a chart here, because color is actually a volumetric concept. It's not two-dimensional and it's not linear. We've got a volume that we can play around in. Now here, we've got a BT709 color volume. And you can see here that we've got our 100 level. That's 100 nits of brightness. So this central point here will be your D65, your white point, as bright as you can go. And that's as bright as you can take the various colors that you've got. And you can see the base of the triangle down here is the same footprint as we've got on the yellow triangle on the right. Now, if we can go a whole lot brighter, that's of course going to increase the volume of this. So we're going to have more colors and a greater range to play around in. If we then add the Rec 2020 color space to it, we can see that we get a substantially improved range of colors as well as brightnesses to work with. So HDR needs to be considered in both of these concepts. Now, cameras work, they generally capture colors by using something called a Bayer filter, where we filter out different colors, and we then generate output pixels based on the value of 3 or more of those. That means that the chemical processes involved in creating that Bayer filter differ from manufacturer to manufacturer. I'm pleased to say that Sony in the F55 and 65 are able to cover basically all of Rec 2020 with the color filter arrays we've developed for those cameras, thereby giving you substantially more color space to play around in than in basically anything else. And now with the Rec 2020 adoption, that's something that we can start to think about using for productions, which is fantastic news. So before I go into working with HDR, I'll give you a brief summary. It's about brighter highlights and deeper blacks. We knew that, but it's also about richer colors, and that's very significant. Now, hopefully this image hasn't been too compressed, because I'm going to click a button and it's going to go from SDR to HDR. Now, like I said earlier, it's a representation of HDR rather than actually HDR. But before I do it, pay attention to particularly the cloud up here and around sort of the base of the mountain, the amount of detail we've got in there. It looks okay at the moment, but you'll see in a second. Detail around this hubcap down here, and the gravel under this car here are 3 points I'd point out. So when I hit this now, you can see that we've got a much nicer gradation of cloud to sky. We haven't lost the blue to white nearly as early. We've got a lot more information in the mountain around here. It's giving us a lot more texture and detail. We've actually got this cloud along this top edge, which had almost entirely disappeared before because the brightness behind it was just taking everything to white. Sorry, I jumped forward. We've also got a lot more detail in the gravel under this car. It's now just not a black space. We haven't lost the detail to the murk. It is now continuation of the gravel with a shadow on it rather than just a patch of darkness.
It's an incredible difference, isn't it?
It's very significant, and like I say, if you can get along to somewhere where you can see this equipment actually being used, and by all means there are productions out there. Amazon and Netflix are already streaming HDR. A number of major productions have been done that way. Netflix's Marco Polo was one of the first, for example. If you've got an HDR TV, by all means plug it in and have a look at it. It is a substantially improved viewing experience. It just looks completely different. So working with HDR, what I said about OETF and EOTF, these are really important concepts when we're working with this stuff. An optical electro transfer function, OETF, takes the sensor information and converts it to data so that we can work with it. So basically, it's the mathematical process of converting the electron voltage, which is caused by photons hitting the sensor, into a value, and then presenting that value once it comes back through onto a screen with the EOTF. They're just opposites of each other. One converts light into data, the other converts data into light. Now there are a few different kinds of them and they do different things, and we'll go through those here.
Before we move on, sorry,
yeah.
It's just someone has just asked whether we can flick between the SDR and the HDR.
We can do indeed. Let's jump back and do that while we're here. So this is the SDR image. So just to reiterate, have a look at the top edge of the mountain. You can very, very faintly, I hope, make out the edge of a cloud there. The detail just in the left-hand area of the cloud here, the gravel under the car. Okay, so this is the SDR image. I'll now flick on to the HDR image. And that's the sort of difference.
You just flick back.
There's back again, back to SDR. And then forwards again to HDR. So transfer functions. So let's talk about some of these different curves and what they do, because a lot of these are going to come up in a lot of discussions when you talk to people about working with HDR. Like any broadcast technology, like color television even, like NTSC and PAL, like HD and HD Ready, like 720, like 50p versus 50i versus 25p versus 24 versus 2498. Like every technology, like anaglyph versus, what's the other one? Oh, there are 3D technologies as well. We never quite managed to agree on what the right way of doing something is. And in HDR, unfortunately, it's no different. But there are good reasons, and a lot of the others have fallen by the wayside. So I've chosen to focus on these 4 particular ways of working with HDR. Well, 3 ways of working with HDR, and one which is SDR for comparison. So here we've got, if we have a look at this, we can see our brightness level down across the bottom here. We've got Rec 709, our purple curve here. It's not quite as big as its new HDR cousins. It only goes up to 100 nits. There's not a lot of stuff to show there. We've then got S-Log. Now, S-Log, Sony Log, is a system that we've devised for getting the best out of our sensors. Most camera manufacturers who are doing any kind of high dynamic range capable sensor will have their own log curve. The reason those are proprietary is because we're all building our own sensors or getting our sensors from somewhere, and we know the best way to get the most information off that sensor. And that's what S-Log in its various guises is for. There's S-Log, S-Log2, S-Log3, S-Log3.Cine. I'll touch a bit on that in a moment, but fundamentally in terms of getting stuff off the camera sensor, that's the way to get the most off it. And that's generally what we would say if you're going through a grading process and you want to have the most creative flexibility about getting those full 14 stops off the camera. That's how we do it. We've then got something most commonly referred to as PQ. It's PQ stands for perceptual quantizer. It is also officially now known as ST2084 because it's become an adopted standard. Now that's a pure HDR standard. It doesn't do SDR at all. We've then got hybrid log gamma. I'm going to talk about PQ and hybrid log in the next slide in a bit more detail. But hybrid log is then easier to work with because it's backwards compatible with Rec. 709, because you're always going to have a decision to make. So let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. So PQ goes up to 10,000 nits in brightness. Now that is not something you want to be sat in a dark theater watching. That is enough room to maneuver, really. There are no displays that get anywhere near 10,000 nits in dynamic range. It's huge. In terms of just the brightness that could put out, it's enormous. There really isn't much going far above about 4,000 really that exists in the world at the moment. The difficulty with it is that it is tailored to an HDR production, so it's very, very good for that, but it isn't necessarily that good if you grade something to PQ and then try and show it on an SDR TV. Now again, this is an issue that we had with black and white television in the addition of color. There they got around it by not sending an RGB signal to a TV, but they added a chroma subcarrier, which a black and white TV couldn't understand. So if you had a color TV, it understood the subcarrier. Hooray, you got color TV. If you had a black and white TV, nothing changed. That's great. In the HDR world, it's a little trickier. Indeed, in the HD world, it's a little trickier because we never found a way to make that really work. You can downscale HD to SD, and you can sort of scale SD up to HD, but you can't get an HD signal to work on an SD TV. And the broadcasters had to start new channels, which was quite a lot of work and quite expensive. So PQ is going to look fantastic if you know you're going to HDR. If you don't know, then there's hybrid log gamma. Hybrid log gamma was developed by a sort of collaborative effort between the BBC and NHK, the Japanese national broadcaster. And the nice thing about that is that an SDR TV will be able to see the hybrid log curve and understand what's going on with it and be able to show a good picture. It is going to be a little different to how a pure SDR graded picture would be, but it's entirely watchable and it's fine, and that's backwards compatible. So this kind of decision is something that you're going to have to make, and depending on where your stuff ends up, it's quite significant to think of it. It's not the end of the world, and I'll come back again. That's something I'm going to come back to later. But hybrid log doesn't go nearly as high. It goes up to 400 nits of dynamic range. Now, if you've ever seen 400 nits of dynamic range, it is a world away from 100. Remember, we're talking about a logarithmic progression here. So it looks completely different, and you'll find it very HDR-y. Don't think that an increase from 100 to 400 is a small increase. It's not. It's only when you compare it to 10,000, which is the almost mathematically impossibly massive increase that PQ provides us. So those are decisions that you're going to have to make.
So in the illustration, when you were flicking between the two,
yeah,
I know it's difficult to approximate, but would that be more akin to the hybrid log gamma, you know, the 400?
Between those two, I mean, we have, that frame is taken from a piece of sample footage that we have, which was shot on F65, and we've had, we've graded that out to all of these different ones. Really, in that shot, you're not getting brightness that is so bright that it's going beyond the 400 nits of what hybrid log can show us. So in that particular way, you could get the same result going either way.
Right.
But there are shots with more range in them where you might want to.
But as an example, even that would be even better, if you like, if it was you know, showing 400, you know, the full 400.
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because
Yeah,
of course everything we're showing here is a max of 100.
Yes. Although we're saying, well, that's great, that's nothing like it would show.
No, indeed.
In reality. Yeah.
Indeed.
Fine.
So let's move on, because I've been talking for far longer than I was expecting I would. Up to this point, certainly far longer than I was talking to myself, sat at my desk distracting people yesterday. Let's talk about working with HDR and what impact this actually has on your camera and what you're going to do with that. So we'll start with some of the higher end models that we've got. F65, of course, pure thoroughbred cinema camera running at full tilt, 5.5 gigabits a second. It's a big, heavy camera. F55 and F5 and the FS7. Now, the thing that unites these is that they have something called Cine EI mode, which is Cinema Exposure Index. And that locks the camera ISO to maximize the dynamic range. You can change the iris to change which part of the scene you're looking at, but changing the ISO off base doesn't make a huge amount of sense if you're shooting HDR. You want to be using the iris to modify that, but of course ISO has a fixed ceiling. You're going to hit the noise floor, you're going to hit the top, and you're going to cover the sensor with static. But really the native, where you get the greatest dynamic range of the sensor, is the only sensible place to be. Cine EI mode then also, because you're getting the whole dynamic range of the camera, which is about 14 stops, which is really a lot, it's going to assume that you're going to be grading it. I wouldn't shoot something Cine EI and then expect to just turn that around and send it through. I would make sure when you're planning your workflow that you have a grading process in it. Then the optoelectrical transfer function, we've come back to that. S-Log2 or S-Log3, those are both available in all of these different cameras. S-Log3, for those who are more into this world, is much more sort of compliant when you're grading it. It'll feel a lot more like Cineon. Primaries will come out a little bit punchier than an S-Log2. They'll both get a broadly similar amount of dynamic range out of the camera, which is about 15 times that of a straight 709 curve. Then the codec and the RAW, and this is another significant thing. Because we've got that many more colors, one of the key things to keep in mind is the bit depth of what you're recording this to. Because if you've only got a few colors like we do in 709, an 8-bit gradation between them of 256 steps might be acceptable. On cameras like these, where you've got a big dynamic range, I really wouldn't recommend shooting to an 8-bit codec, because you're not going to have a lot of room to maneuver within that, particularly since you're Cine EI and you're making choices about what part of the dynamic range to accept. In all of these, there are different ways of recording RAW. That's going to give you 16-bit or 12-bit on the FS7 with an external recorder. That's then a lot more room to maneuver. But XAVC as well works perfectly well. You're not going to have as much creative freedom, but you're going to have far smaller files which are accepted in far more systems. Now, you've also got custom mode hypergammas in the F5, 55 and FS7. Now, these aren't going to give you quite the creative freedom, but if you want to turn it around quickly, these can also be a little bit easier. One mention I will make: people sometimes shy away from the hypergammas because they've got these slightly intimidating names. This is a description of what they do. So if we take 3250G36, that is 325% of Rec 709. So 325 nits of brightness, 100 of Rec 709 is 100. We move up to 0, that's a 100% video level. You can see further down on that list there are a couple of 9s. Those are then 109% video levels, which is full gamut RGB if I'm not mistaken, in which case you'll need tools that can support that, but basically everything these days does. G is just full gamma, and then how you expose it: 36% brightness on a waveform monitor with a 20% gray card. So that's then how you're exposing those different gammas to get the most out of the camera. So that's what those do. Don't shy away from them if you want to turn something around relatively quickly. In HDR discussions, we frequently get caught up in looking at sort of the cinema end of things, where people have a substantial tens of thousands of pounds grading budget. They've got offline assistants and DITs, and that's not realistic for 95, 99% of productions I know. So trying to sort of keep things a bit realistic. Now, if we look at the FS5, that's a slightly different camera because it doesn't have Cine EI, but it does have S-Log 2 or 3, so that's still going to be the way to get the most dynamic range out of the camera. It has a RAW output, so if you can record RAW and you've got that option, then record RAW. That's going to get you the most creative freedom afterwards. Again, that's going to be 12-bit. Other than that, use a 10-bit codec internally, which in the FS5 is going to be an HD codec. If you're very, very careful about how you shoot it, you could shoot it into 4K and 8-bit, but 8-bit really won't tolerate a lot, and I would try and avoid very smoothly gradiated things like blue skies and things like that, because you'll probably get banding on it, simply because you're trying to get so much color and so much information. You want 1024 steps, not 256. You've then got the cine gammas, which again might make these things a little bit easier. Cine 1, 2, 3, and 4, and all of this information is available on Sony's training portal, which I'll mention at the end. But Cine 1, smooth contrast in darker areas, accentuate change in bright areas, clips at 109. Cine 2, I've written clips at 109, but actually clips at 100, otherwise they'd be the same. That's a misprint on my part. Cine 3, graduation change in the dark. Cine 4, reduce contrast in dark, increase in bright. And again, that's a 109% curve. Any other camera, now you can take this logic and put it to anything. Record with as big a bit depth as possible, and then in S-Log if it's available, or a hyper gamma if it's available. Of course, if you're in the 709 world, you're throwing away all of the extra dynamic range that you want. So if you're recording straight into 709, you're not going to be able to go HDR. It's going to be like that example where we had the camera shooting 16-bit RAW, the transmission 8-bit. You could pull it back out like the TV trying to replicate HDR, but it's not really going to work. So let's have a look at the workflow. We'll use an F55 in this case because it conveniently does RAW and XAVC, so I can talk about both flows at the same time. It's capturing 14 stops of dynamic range into RAW or XAVC. RAW, 12 or 16-bit, depending on the camera, enormous post-production flexibility, higher hardware requirements. RAW files are big. It is the nature of them. We also have XOCN now with the AXS R7 recorder, which allows you to do basically to get RAW equivalent quality files at much smaller file sizes, but they're still going to be larger than XAVC. But particularly with the RAW workflow, there are more demands on workflow design. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to start thinking about doing offlines, depending on what sort of machine you're editing it on. Storage and backups are going to become more complicated, so there's a bit more to think about in that regard. In XAVC, this will work, but you don't have the full flexibility. It's only 10-bit, so you can't push it as far. But considering that we're talking about a jump to 10-bit when still today the most popular codec for professional production by far is still MPEG-2, which is an 8-bit codec in HD. So it's going to give you more than that, and it is enough to record very good HDR in. It will work in conventional post-production tools and is a much simpler workflow with XAVC than with RAW. So there's our grade, and then we've got to make the decision. Where are we going to? Are we outputting to SDR 709 in a separate PQ? If we're giving it to Netflix, we might well be, because Netflix, being an OTT provider, they don't need to launch a second channel, they can just have 2 copies. And if your TV says, hey Netflix, I'm an HDR TV, it'll get the HDR version. Likewise for SDR. If it's going to a traditional broadcaster, they might have more difficulty with that, and they might define HLD. Now, the important thing to remember is that if you shot it HDR, and if you remember in the beginning, we talked about the poll, we need to. If you're exposing right and shooting 10-bit, you're probably already shooting HDR. Certainly if you want any kind of flexibility to an 8-bit or to an SDR grade, if you're trying to make creative decisions about what you're capturing, you're probably already shooting HDR, you're just not distributing it that way. The important thing to remember is that you can always go back and regrade. This is like the security of film in the old days. It's why I have all of the James Bond films on Blu-ray, is because they were able to go back to the very, very high resolution of the film, rescan them, and then re-release them on the higher digital format. I'm sure they'll be along in 4K shortly, and I'll buy them again. But the same thing counts for HDR. You can go back to your original master and regrade it for whatever people happen to settle on in time. We recommend, of course, that you stay in S-Log for as long as possible, because S-Log will bring as much information from the sensor. Just like compression, every time you change something, you'll lose something. Working in S-Log will give you a lot of flexibility. The nice thing about working with color, of course, is that you can use LUTs, lookup tables, and apply whatever look you want to something. You want to see what it looks like this, like this, like this. You can do all of that simultaneously, but I'd keep the source in S-Log for as late as possible until the output and navigate through using LUTs until that point. Now we've then got the concept called Instant HDR. Instant HDR would be really nice. We've got simple workflows in HD and 709 world for producing content. The vast majority of stuff doesn't get much of a grade, it just gets color correction, a little bit of change to the white balance here, maybe pull down a peak white there. It doesn't go through a creative grade as such. So you just record in camera, straight into 709, broadcast to 709, happy days, very straightforward. Wouldn't it be nice if we can do that? Ha! We can. Because we've now, at NAB in April, we announced version 2 of the Z150 and version 4 of the FS5. They will have the ability to shoot directly into hybrid log gamma, which will then give you all of that dynamic range from that in XAVC, and you can then just play that out. And we were showing that off at NAB, and people were really amazed at the quality that we managed to get out of it, even in 4K. Now, I don't know how they did that, because the 4K codecs in those cameras, as some of our eagle-eyed listeners, eagle-eared listeners probably know, is an 8-bit codec. So I think they've done some very clever stuff with the mapping within those cameras on the hardware side to allow that to work. I didn't believe it either until I saw it. So I mean, by all means, have a look at it. But of course, if you're shooting in HD, and HD HDR is very much a thing as well. You're still in the 10-bit world in those as well, but it was just a caveat in case someone said, but 4K. That's something there to keep in mind. So that's sort of camera talk. There's a lot of other infrastructure around here. I'll touch briefly on monitors. We've got 3 professional HDR monitors, the middle one being the BVMX300. That's sort of our 30-inch flagship Class A grading monitor, 1000 nit. Beautiful thing. It will show you BT 2020, and when I was talking about that volumetric color earlier, it will show you all of that. It's OLED, so the blacks are black. It goes right up to 1000 nits. It is a stunning monitor. The X550 isn't quite as bright as that, but it is much bigger. A lot of people said, can we have a client monitor that can show this stuff? And we said, yes, we can, but we'll do something else cool with it. It has 4 separate image processing engines in it. So you can feed a straight S-Log image into it, and then you can say, okay, well, I want each of the quarters of this to show me a different EOTF. So I want S-Log in the top left. I want to see what's coming straight in. I would like to see hybrid log here. I would like to see PQ here. I would like to see 709 here, and see all of the different versions at the same time. It's a very clever thing, and it is still, in terms of the color space, wider than DCI-P3, which is slightly larger. That people will know that from the cinema space. And then we've got the E171, which is a newer one, which I think actually, well, a bit newer, came out at IBC last year, I think, so about 8 months old. But that's in a much smaller 17-inch one, a little bit more portable HDR. It's an HD resolution one, but BT 2020 wide color space, BVM, so still Class A grading monitor as well. Now, those are the monitors. I'll talk quickly about that because Sony as a whole is very much behind what HDR is and where it's going. You will be as well once you see what the pictures are. They are very impressive. So of course we're making pro cameras, but there's also consumer cameras, and again they're doing a sort of straight to HDR, HLG type workflow that'll work on any TV. We engineer our codecs to support this stuff, and the monitors I've just shown you. There is also, and I haven't touched upon it in this presentation, a whole ecosystem of live production stuff for people doing, for example, live production of theatre programs, which have always been difficult to film because you've got bright lights and very dark. Sports, being able to see the shady side of a stadium has always been a challenge to people, and HDR completely eliminates that. Sparks off the bottom of motorcycles and things like that. It's really exciting stuff. So live production is another area where we're putting a lot of effort working on, and indeed being part of the standards and the transfer functions and working with those things. The reason I've put OETF and EOTF into this as discrete items on this list is that our approach to making the hardware is that Sony as a whole, we just want to make good production equipment. We're not betting the farm on any particular standard. We've got S-Log, that's going to be the best to get the stuff off the sensors because we make those. But the way we've engineered the monitors is that so that we can retrofit any curve that might turn up. So we retrofitted PQ into them as a free firmware upgrade when that started to become a dominant force. And we're going to continue that way. We don't really mind where people end up on that discussion, but we're going to make sure that people can work in it. We now have, I think I counted yesterday, and there were 19 different Bravias on the market that do HDR and various things. We've even got a phone. We've got a 4K HDR telephone, the Xperia XZ Premium, which is interesting. We do display walls, we do cinema projectors, we do workflow equipment like RawViewer and other tools to be able to do this. Yeah. And we've got a team of people in Japan called the Alliance team who work with all our third-party partners, Avids and Apples and Blackmagics and all of these people who make workflow tools to make sure that they work properly with all of the equipment that we're making, and their full focus is on that. So as a whole organization, I mean, Sony Professional is a small bit of, I think there's $165,000 worldwide, but basically everyone apart from the audio people is very concerned with this stuff. So if you want to recap on a lot of this stuff, now of course this exact presentation is being recorded and you'll have access to that, but if you want a bit more detail on this stuff and a recap and indeed granular sort of how to go through the menus and set up the cameras for HDR recording, head to training.sony-europe.com or pro.sony/training and have a look at that. There's a huge range of very interesting courses there with a wealth of information in them, so you can get quite a lot out of that. And then, of course, there's also my good friends at Visual Impact's own webpage and their own resources. Their blog's got a lot of fantastic stuff on it. So yeah, that was my bit of the presentation. Thank you for putting up with my droning voice for all of this time.
That's fine. Just another quick sort of plug, if you like. We are going to have Sony back in a few weeks, and where you can actually get your hands on the camera and see them doing it live in our demo studio, so you can witness that as well as, so now you've got all the background information. I'm sure you'll be listening to it on this evening, just to recap a lot of things, so you'll know all the difficult questions to ask once we see it actually physically here, as I say, in a few weeks' time. So please look out for that event email. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Certainly, I think a lot of people would be blown away with that presentation. It was fantastic. Thanks for that, Tom. If anyone has any questions, then please do them now. If not, then we shall. Here we go. When exposing log using zebras, where should one place the highlights at the IRE scale?
Svein Rune, god dagen, håper alt står til fint. That was me. Well, yeah, I'm half Norwegian, so I saw that. What I would recommend for that, rather than I go through this, because there are different cameras at different levels, there are two resources I would recommend you have a look at. This is a question. I'll read out the question because I forgot everyone can't see it. When exposing log using zebras, where should one place the highlights at on the IRE scale? How far is it possible to under or overexpose an image before whites are clipped and blacks are lost? Now, that is a question that relies on a fair bit of theory, but that theory then is underpinned by which camera you're using. Have a look at the training portal. Again, if I run back to that, training.sony-europe.com, we have interactive trainings that you can then go back to, look at, and get all of that covered in a very detailed and referencey way, rather than me running through it right now.
Sure. Okay, terrific presentation. Oh, I shouldn't have read that out, really. Well, there you go. Someone knows the Latin word.
Thank you to Shite David Crossman. Yes, I thought it might be. Glimrende, Svein Rune. Jeg er glad for at du likte det. Is HDR compatible with 4K? Absolutely. The Rec 2020 standard governs both of those things. So from a standards body organizational point of view, they are or they can be one and the same thing. HDR is a technology that underpins the pixels. It's quite nicely illustrated when we were first releasing 4K cameras. Everyone said, particularly a lot of the cinema people said, oh, we don't need more pixels. Give us better pixels. This is better pixels.
Yes.
That's what this is.
Yeah.
Are these platforms, so we've got a question from Tom Staniford. Most of my content is delivered on web, hosted on YouTube or Vimeo. Are these platforms ready for HDR? Is it more down to the end viewer's PC monitor? It is down to, in that case, YouTube and Vimeo. YouTube, I know, has HDR capacity to be able to send that stuff. So it's, in that case, basically if YouTube can get it to the house, it's down to the viewer to have a monitor that can then show it.
Sure.
Let's see.
If I shoot S-Log3.
If I shoot S-Log3, then an FCPX drop on the S-Log3 option. Does that do an instant grade to Rec 709? No, it shouldn't. It should just leave you in S-Log3. Although I must admit to not being as familiar with FCPX as I am with Adobe and Avid, and indeed many other things. But I don't believe it does. It should just leave it as S-Log3. If we're talking about a monitor LUT, then that might well be what it does. I don't know quite how the logic on that works, but it could well be that all you're doing is telling it that you are working with S-Log3, and it's then compensating to be able to show you that on your monitor.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people are asking this question, Stevie.
There are, yeah. Stevie Lee has a very good question. Is HDR really worth investing in? Will it really take off, or will it go the same way as 3D TV? There are a couple of things to say about that. Firstly, yes, I didn't have a lot of faith in 3D. I think a lot of people didn't have a lot of faith in 3D. It's a bit annoying. You've got to wear glasses, and it never really quite works.
I think 3D, doesn't it come back every 25 years or something?
About every 30, yeah.
30,
yeah. So, I mean, yeah, 80s, 2010s, it was there in the 50s, 20s, and in the 1890s they had those spinning things. Yeah. What HDR does, I think HDR will at some point stop being a buzzword, and it will just be the way.
The normal, yeah.
Because it really is about taking away a restriction. It's not adding something, it's taking something away fundamentally. If you look at the grading process for, I mean, if you take, I'll think of a better example. We had a launch event for the X300 monitor, which I went to, which we did in conjunction with Filmlight, the grading people. And they loaded up a raw clip from an F65, which was shot S-Log3. And they showed it to us. And I thought, oh, you've already done the conversion. It looks normal. I said, no, we haven't done the work yet. It's just that we can show so much more of it. It meant that from their perspective, from the process of grading, you had to throw away so much less that the work became easier. And I mean, on that, is HDR worth investing in? From a camera perspective, being the UK Sony camera guy, you've probably already invested in it. If you've got a 10-bit camera that's less than 5 years old, you can probably record HDR already. So that side of it's already there. It's about keeping differences in the workflow in mind, and certainly one of the weaker points in terms of a user or a man on the streets opinion of it would be is about getting bright enough pixels in your TV. Now that, I think, is going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
You look at HDR RAW, it looks desaturated as well as luminance value is not being mapped to display by monitor. So that's a question by Stephen Montgomery. Saturation works in the same way in HDR as it does anywhere else. HDR RAW, in terms of that, should look as desaturated as anything does. That shouldn't be too particularly different. A lot of that has to do with what kind of display monitor you've got and if it's actually able to correctly replicate the OETF, EOTF signal flow throughout the workflow. Because of course that's going to be coming in, then something's going to be happening to it within, for example, the grading suite or the editor. We can go back to that FCPX question about whether that's a LUT or not. And apologies again for not knowing exactly what the answer to that was. But I mean, ultimately, saturation comes into play in HDR because you can saturate further than you used to be able to. Because that color volume is greater, you can go further than you could. But again, there is, and I've frequently seen issues with people not necessarily mapping the signal path right, and no fault of theirs. It's difficult. I'm sure I'd get it wrong. And there being a slightly different nomenclature in basically every single tool that you use for how that kind of signal flow is managed in terms of input LUTs and output LUTs and all that type of stuff. Again, we've got some excellent webinars from Sony. If you look for any webinar featuring a guy called Pablo Garcia, who works at our Pinewood facility, and he grades, he is a colorist, and he's produced a lot of different webinars and stuff for us on exactly that topic. So I would have a look at that.
Terrific. Thank you. I think that's the last question. Unless anyone else has got any questions, I think we'll wrap it there. Oh, last one coming in from Peter. If I'm not shooting at S-Log3, do I need to learn to color grade to use my pics?
Do you need to learn to color grade? I mean, there are different levels of learning to color grade, and there's a level of, you don't necessarily need to learn to grade creatively, but there are, as there always have been in anything you're producing, ceiling levels and floor levels and gamma and gain and these things to make an image conform to what you're sending it to, which are fairly fundamental stuff anyway, and that stuff hasn't changed. I understand the benefits from Stevie Lee, but it's the end user reception of it. I just feel that the OTA channels will kill it because their infrastructure is so slow to adapt to new technologies. I think if you spoke to YouTube, Netflix and Amazon, they would say they don't care and they're taking market share hand over fist from those people anyway. So it might well be that the over-the-air channels need to adopt this to keep up, and that sea change is driving this. The cinema industry is very keen to get into it, despite the difficulties for them, because of course when you are bouncing light from a projector off a screen, it's much harder to make that kind of brightness happen. But then you've got various organizations talking about making enormous LED panels to deal with this type of thing. So I'm actually very convinced by this. I think it's a very convincing technology. But like I say, you don't have to do it now. Keep it in mind when you're shooting, leave that on the shelf, and if you can sell it again later, then great.
I think people like Netflix have already proved by creating their own content just how powerful they could be. I think, as you say, the traditional broadcasters probably thought, oh, we're safe, they'll just regurgitate our content, but they're coming back with...
They're coming back with their own. The other thing I would add to that is, of course, that the BBC, possibly the most traditional of broadcasters, developed hybrid log gamma with NHK, who are, if anything, even more conservative.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's it's very much a movement, and because it makes things easier rather than more difficult, I've got a lot of faith in this. And the pictures, once you've seen them, are very convincing on their own.
Very much so, very much so.
Thank you, David. Very kind.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nice to get some really good positive feedback. I think we need to wrap it up there. I think we could talk all day about HDR and wider topics, but maybe that's for another day. Thanks again, Tom, for doing.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
A really fantastic presentation, and thanks to everyone for listening, for joining in. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.